Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the July 2021 meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub online. My name is Richard Saunders from the Australian Skeptics and the Skeptic Zone podcast. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting tonight. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, it's my sad duty to also tell you that our dear friend Shelley Stocken died unexpectedly over the weekend. Shelley was a former reporter on the Skeptic Zone podcast and a contributor to the Skeptic magazine and a comrade in the fight against the anti-vaxxers. Australian skeptics extend our heartfelt condolences to Shelley's family and friends. Thank you very much, Shelley. It was a pleasure to know you. Don't forget you can subscribe to our magazine, to which Shelley was a contributor. The Skeptic, this year celebrating 40 years of publication. In fact, you can access most of the back issues for free at skeptics.com.au. And I happen to have received my copy in the letterbox today. There we go. A great read. And please remember to put Thursday, the 5th of August in your diaries for the next Skeptics in the Pub. Hopefully in the pub, but maybe online. Well, that's up to COVID-19. Our guest speaker will be none other than Professor Paul Willis, and his talk will be about Beyond Atheist. It promises to be a very interesting talk. Please keep an eye on our meetup page for more details. Now tonight we present Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, who will talk about coffee. Coffee. Is it good for your health or is it bad? The internet is awash with conflicting information. Gid will examine where the truth lies. Maybe it's somewhere in between. Gid is an epidemiologist working in chronic diseases with particular focus on the social determinants that control our health. He writes a regular blog at medium.com/@GidMK, covering science communication, public health, and what that new study you've read about actually means. He is also a member of the committee of Australian Skeptics Inc. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our guest, and you can do that via the link on the Twitch page you are watching at the moment. That link will take you to our Slido page. We'll keep an eye on that and see the questions come up, and we can pose those to Gid after the talk. If you haven't already done so at Twitch, please hit the follow button. Then you'll be alerted to when we're broadcasting again. But for now, having another coffee, please join me in welcoming Gid for tonight's talk.
Hi, it's great to be here. And I have to say, so I was going to, as a gag, have a cup of coffee here and drink it while I talked, but I decided last minute that I would rather drink wine. So this will be my pretend coffee for the evening, and apologies for not being as funny as I could be. I'm Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz. I'm going to be talking about coffee. I have some slides that I'm going to bring up. Before I start my presentation, I should just say quickly that I've made a terrible mistake, which is to order food and not think about my timing very well. So there is a chance, almost certainty, that my doorbell will ring partway through the talk. I apologize. You guys can listen to my doorbell ring, and I'll sit here and kind of look up at the sky while things happen in the background, and the doorbell eventually stops. Again, I apologize. That was terribly unprofessional, and what can I say? It's a weeknight. Anyway, so tonight I'm talking about, is coffee good for your health? I'm Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz. You can follow me on Twitter at GidMK. You can follow me on Medium at GidMK. Facebook is at GidMK Health Nerd. There is a theme. It is obvious. So find me online. I would like to start this talk with a very important note. I'm not a doctor. I am an epidemiologist, so I look at kind of study design and evidence in a broader sense. But I am not your medical clinician. I'm not the person who is taking care of your health. My advice forever and always is that if a doctor tells you to do something, you should probably do it regardless of what some guy on the internet says. Tonight, I am the guy on the internet, and my advice is less good than your clinicians. So please listen to your doctor. Please don't listen to me if my advice conflicts with theirs. I've had this problem come up before. You think this, why would I give this warning at the start of my talks? But it turns out it's very important. So key point. Now, I'm going to be talking about coffee. I'm particularly going to be talking about the kind of claims that you see reported on in the media, right? And I think it's important to delineate the sort of headline that you often see and the sort of really specific health claim. So I wrote a blog about coffee recently, and I had people telling me, like a gastroenterologist, write in and say, well, you haven't covered all of coffee's health benefits. We use it for a specific form of gastritis. And I had an endocrinologist who works in obesity and bariatric surgery tell me that they use it for gastric clearance in the hours post bariatric surgery for some people. And I think those are very interesting points. They are certainly elements where coffee has a positive or negative association with health, but they are also kind of really small, specific things, and they're not the sort of thing that most of us read in a newspaper or see online these days. So here are some examples of the sort of claim that I'm going to be looking at tonight. So we've got the benefits. Could coffee really make you look younger? I mean, you know, it would be delightful. I could maybe restore the hair to my head, and I would no longer be quite so bald. The benefits versus the harms. So on the other side, we've got these sort of claims that if you drink more than this many cups of coffee a week, you will die horribly, presumably. And I think for me, this is separated into three broad categories. Firstly, we've got the extremely ridiculous fluff, and these are extremely silly news pieces that tend to be based on research that could never prove anything. They are either based on preclinical research or papers that really don't say much about anything at all. Then we've got this sort of evidence-based harms where there is perhaps a signal of risk for coffee, and we've got evidence-based benefits on the other side, where again, there's this sort of signal of benefit that we might expect from drinking coffee. The other thing I should mention is when I'm talking about coffee here, I'm specifically talking about the sort of coffee that you drink from a cafe. I'm not talking, and I'm really avoiding entirely supplements and other drugs based on coffee. So there are, for example, green coffee extracts, which are part of the supplement industry. You can buy them in many places or online. I'm not concerning myself with that sort of intervention tonight. It is a different topic, and I could cover it in another talk, but for tonight, we're just talking about this sort of delicious latte that you see on the screen right now. So here's some examples of ridiculous fluff. These are headlines. So I should say I put together this entire presentation today. These are all examples of stuff that I've just grabbed off the internet. And if you see a preponderance of the Daily Mail, that is not a coincidence. So drink coffee, morning coffee before an early workout to burn fat faster. Drinking coffee can assist with weight loss. This was one of my favorite ones that I found today. Coffee drinking gives you stronger orgasms. This is the sort of thing, there's very little scientific evidence. Usually it's based on one or two very small studies, and there really isn't any kind of debunking to do here. There is no reason to believe that this is true. They're great headlines. I can see why journalists would write these stories. I have no issue with reporting them. They're just so far from being true that it's not particularly scientific in any way. Okay, so let's move on to coffee harms, and this is where we're thinking about like evidence-based harms that we might actually have some reason to believe that they are accurate. So the first thing to note is that caffeine is a neurotoxin. It can kill you, and obviously it is present in coffee. So I always love working out exactly what a kind of dangerous dose of coffee is for different people. It varies. It depends very much on the type of coffee you drink. So espresso shots versus instant coffee, there can be very different amounts of caffeine depending on your brand, on your roast, on a variety of factors. But in general, your average espresso coffee has between 50 and 100 milligrams of caffeine in it, pure caffeine. Again, this is a massive generalization. It depends on which brand you're drinking. But in general, between 50 and 100 grams of caffeine. In general, a neurotoxic dose of caffeine starts between 1.5 and 3 grams of caffeine, depending on who's drinking it. And again, this is for an adult. So this is for your kind of average weight adult. Children are completely different. Kids generally probably shouldn't drink coffee, but this is another story. So if you do the simple calculus there, a neurotoxic dose of coffee tends to be somewhere between 30 to 40 espresso shots, which works out, depending on your brand or what you're drinking, to be, somewhere around 30 cups of coffee a day. And that potentially could cause you serious harm. Now, most people don't get anywhere near that. What I've always thought, and this is just simply based on these calculations, is that if you're sticking to less than 1 gram of caffeine a day total, which is less than 10 to 20 coffees, or kind of the equivalent, which is, Red Bulls have about 100 milligrams of caffeine in them, etc. You should be well below these sort of really dangerous doses. But again, this is the sort of thing that you should probably ask your doctor, not the guy talking to you online. It is worth noting, though, that caffeine can kill you if you drink too much coffee. In this context, too much coffee is really a lot of coffee. It is very dangerous. But moving on from swimming pools worth of coffee, let's think about actual health harms that you would experience in your daily life. And this is one of my the most fun slides that I've ever made. I call this the Daily Mail Special because it is all of the things that coffee both causes and cures. So what have we got? We've got coffee increases your risk of prostate cancer. It decreases your risk of prostate cancer, but it doubles your risk of tumors in your esophagus. It halves your risk of bowel cancer, but it also may raise your risk of all cancers due to microplastics. It raises the risk of cancer in children, but it cuts the risk of breast tumor cancers returning. So that is just a vast field of evidence that I'm representing in a very funny way with headlines from the Daily Mail. And I think it's interesting to look at all of these studies and think about how they were done and what they really mean. The studies behind the headlines, because the studies don't represent the headlines very well. So for an example, one small example, if we look at this study, piping hot tea or coffee doubles the risk of developing esophageal cancer. This is a very interesting piece of research that was done in Iran. It's a very specific situation where people drink a lot of hot tea and hot coffee, but mostly hot tea. And they measured people's tea intake once at the beginning of a 10-year period. And they did this by giving them a cup of tea and asking them to drink it when they thought that that it was the right temperature for them. And then they used that to define people as either hot or medium or kind of low heat tea drinkers, or coffee, but it was predominantly tea. And then they looked at their risk of esophageal cancer a decade later. And they found an association after controlling for some confounding factors. That is, in and of itself, quite unconvincing, because there are many reasons why someone might drink tea hot. There are issues with reverse causality. So people who already are developing esophageal cancer may be more likely to drink their tea hot because they've lost some sensation. And also there are lots of confounding factors that get in the way of the association between kind of the cancer and the hot tea. So that is one study that you see a headline for, sounds scary. I think the relative risk here, it says it increases your relative risk by 90%. So you're nearly double as likely to have cancer if you drink hot tea. Hot tea here being defined as 60 degrees Celsius or higher, which I don't think is that hot, but anyway. But if you actually dig into the evidence, it's not nearly as convincing or as worrying as you might believe. And that is going to be something of a theme during this talk. It's not necessarily that coffee is either a useless or horribly harmful or what have you. Generally speaking, the evidence simply isn't as convincing as you might have heard. And I should also specify, while I'm giving this talk, this is my opinion. I'm an epidemiologist, and this is my kind of reading of the evidence. I haven't read every single study on coffee and health. There are tens of thousands of them. What I've done is had a very strong interest in coffee because I drink several cups a day, and I keep up to date with all the evidence that I can find. I read a lot of the studies on coffee, but it's certainly not comprehensive. So as I said, if you're worried, go see your doctor. Okay, so here's an example of a study, another wonderful example. This is from this piece of research, Coffee Consumption and the Risk of Bladder Cancer. What they found was that overall, very high intakes of coffee were associated with a moderately increased risk of bladder cancer. You can kind of see that in this top left graph, around the 7 and 8 cup mark, or rather above 7 cups, there's an increased risk. A hazard ratio is the ratio of it's a measure of relative risk. Essentially, it's the ratio of risk of cancer in the group who drink more coffee compared to the group who drink less coffee over time. So for a 1 cup increment a day, there was a very modest, statistically significant increase in risk of about 4%. although the P test was not statistically significant, I mean, it's a reasonably interesting association. But this study also looked at potentially confounding factors, and what they found was that the risk was almost entirely confined to people who smoked. And even more specifically, it was almost entirely confined to men who smoked. So people who had never smoked did not see this increased risk, and women who smoked didn't see an increased risk, which is fascinating. So it rather than, this was reported at the time, of course, as coffee increases your risk of cancer, but the actual study found that coffee only increases your risk of cancer if you're a man who smokes. That is not very convincing as a harm for coffee itself. It's much more likely, and I'm sure you can see based on these graphs, that actually the risk was down to something other than coffee causing the problem. Another fascinating study that looked at coffee, this is the effect of coffee consumption on all-cause and total cancer mortality. So they had a very large sample, and they looked at people who drank coffee and split them up into men and women, different amounts of coffee a day. And again, so they controlled for confounding factors. I should just briefly explain. Confounding factors are things that get in between your exposure and your outcome. So they are problems, not problems, they are factors that can cause both the exposure, in this case coffee, and the outcome, in this case cancer. So a classic example of confounding is that more people drown when there are more people eating ice cream. So when people eat ice cream, there are more drownings. And so you could say that drownings are associated with ice cream. And if you take that association to be causal, then you're making a mistake, because actually there's a very obvious confounder. In this case, hot weather. More people swim when it's hot, more people eat ice cream when it's hot, and therefore more people drown when more people eat ice cream. But actually, both caused by the hot weather. Now, in this sort of epidemiological study, they look at many confounding factors. They always adjust for age and sex. They usually adjust for things like income. They adjust for geographic area that people live. They look at all sorts of different factors that can cause both exposures like coffee and outcomes like cancer. Getting back to this study, they looked at all types of cancer. This is every possible diagnosis. They found that overall, there was no association, once you adjusted for all of these confounding factors that I described, between coffee and all diagnoses of cancer. There was a very modest decreased risk for women who drank coffee compared to women who didn't drink coffee. The risk was not present at all for men. And overall, there was no difference between people who drank no coffee and people who drank lots of coffee on their risk of cancer. And this is a really huge study, 600,000 people, 600,000 person years for the women and 400,000 person years for the men. Very long term. But basically, what we find when we look at the literature on coffee and the risk of cancer, of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of whether coffee causes these illnesses, usually from epidemiological evidence, there's a lot of inconsistent and conflicting evidence. Some evidence says that there are harms, but a lot of evidence simply says that there's no association at all. So then we can turn to trials. Now, this is different. This is when we are looking at a randomized trial, usually, or some non-randomized trials where we give one group coffee and we give the other group no coffee, or sometimes decaf coffee to be really certain that it's not the caffeine causing an issue. And if you look at these sorts of experimental trials, randomized, controlled, gold standard of evidence, again, well, what you find is that there's often no difference between the coffee and the non-coffee group. So this rather unreadable graph, I apologize, but I had to nick it straight from the study itself. This graph is from a study that looked at markers of cardiovascular disease and coffee intake. So they had two groups, but all of whom had high cholesterol, and they gave one group coffee, and they gave the other group no coffee. And this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So they took all of the studies that looked at coffee and cholesterol, and as you can see at the bottom, the confidence interval crosses 0. Basically, the mean difference between people who were given coffee and people who were not given coffee on their cholesterol levels was not significantly different. There are several of these trials, so you find them for markers of cancer, markers of diabetes. Often when you give one group coffee, you don't give the other group coffee in a randomized experiment, you find that the markers for the disease that we would expect to change if there was a significant benefit don't. Now, that's not conclusive because cardiovascular disease and cancer take a very long time to develop. Usually these trials look at markers of disease which take a much shorter period of time to develop, but the markers aren't the disease. So improving cholesterol, while obviously very strongly associated with your risk of heart disease, isn't the same as preventing heart attacks, right? That being said, it's quite strong evidence that coffee isn't actually the thing that is causing the harm in this case. Now, there is one specific harm that I think is worth touching on because it is a very commonly debated and very, very common harm for people in the community. That is pregnancy. So any person who's ever tried to get pregnant will know that one of the main pieces of advice is to reduce your coffee intake, reduce your caffeine intake in particular, and to try to drink only 1 cup of coffee or the equivalent a day. And this is a very kind of contentious point, obviously, because it's no one wants to give up coffee, and it's also one of the most harmless and pervasive kind of addictions that we as a society have. And I would hate to give up coffee for even a day, never mind 9 months. So I fully understand how challenging that would be. So this slide has the evidence from another systematic review and meta-analysis looking at observational trials, measuring the harmful impacts of coffee on pregnancy, specifically on miscarriage and on other pregnancy-related outcomes. And what you see, kind of these diamonds at the bottom, it is very hard to read. And again, I apologize. The quality of some of these graphs in scientific papers are not always high. But what you see is that there is a very strong and consistent association between coffee and miscarriage, particularly, and other harms of pregnancy. So this represents a 30% increased risk for women who drink large amounts of coffee compared to women who drink small amounts of coffee during pregnancy for miscarriage. However, again, the relationship is not as consistent as you might imagine, and it's very hard to tease out a causal impact, i.e. to tease out the idea that coffee is causing these miscarriages and pregnancy issues. We know from animal models that very high intakes of caffeine and coffee are associated with pregnancy loss, but lower intakes sometimes are not. I mean, you can actually see that in this meta-analysis as well, that a light coffee intake, which is usually about 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day, was not associated with any increased risk of issues, and particularly miscarriage again. And similarly, this graph A, I think I think B was miscarriage, and I think A was any pregnancy issue. Again, there was no association here between coffee intake and pregnancy harm. And more interestingly, perhaps, there have been randomized controlled trials looking at reducing women's coffee intake during pregnancy, or reducing people's coffee intake, rather, during pregnancy. The Cochrane collaboration, who are kind of the gold standard for this sort of systematic review and meta-analyses that I'm talking about, have done a systematic review and meta-analysis of coffee intake during pregnancy and of randomized controlled trials aimed at reducing caffeine intake during pregnancy. What they found was that the evidence wasn't great, but of the 2 randomized trials that have been run looking at this question, neither found any benefit to reducing coffee intake during pregnancy. And these were studies where they gave one group of women caffeinated coffee and one group of women non-caffeinated coffee, so decaf. So reducing the caffeine intake didn't have a significant benefit. And this is kind of where the pregnancy recommendations come from. So most recommendations are that you limit your caffeine intake to less than 200 milligrams a day. That's the World Health Organization and the CDC are very similar. Some say limit your intake to less than 300 milligrams because the recommendations are also based on kind of American style coffee. That usually means a single cup is the recommendation. If you have like small espressos, they are usually about 80 milligrams, but because you can't measure it, they just recommend 1 cup most of the time. And so that's basically where your recommendations come from, because you've got no association between low intake of caffeine and pregnancy loss, and the RCTs have not demonstrated a benefit to reducing caffeine intake. But it is one of the only harms where there is a fairly strong and fairly consistent relationship, and we're just not certain that it's causal, because when we've intervened and when we've conducted RCTs, they haven't necessarily shown a benefit. Sleep is another interesting one. I mean, caffeine is obviously a stimulant. Stimulants keep you awake. Coffee probably isn't great for sleep. I mean, there's a reason that I'm drinking my wine. Delicious. There's a reason I'm drinking my wine tonight. And not a cup of coffee. It's because I probably wouldn't get to sleep if I drank coffee. And yet, somehow, the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that I dug up to look at whether caffeine systematically impacts your sleep are relatively inconclusive. And it's particularly a problem because there's a massive issue of reverse causality here. Reverse causality is when the thing that you measure could be causing the outcome. So in this case, you say that you measure people's sleep, and then you look at their exposure, which is coffee, and you say that coffee is causing their poor sleep. But a lot of people drink coffee because they don't sleep well and they're very tired. So it could be that poor sleep causes coffee, to put it glibly. So what is the bottom line from the health harms of coffee? I mean, basically, there are lots of associations. It's hard to know what causes what, whether it's coffee causing health problems, or it's simply that the type of person who drinks a lot of coffee, and usually in these studies, a lot of coffee is like 5-10 cups a day, which, I mean, even for me, that's quite a bit, and I drink a lot of coffee. But certainly in lower doses, the associations tend not to be very strong. And, you know, you look at these health harms, and the risks are quite minor in terms of these really big button issues like cancer and diabetes. So those are the health harms, right? Let's look at some of the health benefits of coffee. And now I thought I can't be too mean to the Daily Mail. They are an easy target, but there are lots of easy targets. So let's look at the Mirror. Aha! My dinner has arrived. So this is going to be our brief interlude where instead of talking about coffee, we listen to my doorbell. I might briefly, indeed. I might briefly go and stop the doorbell at least. One sec. I am so sorry about that. I am back, and I will keep talking about coffee. Okay, let's get back to here. So yes, I'm going to make fun of the Daily Mirror. Sorry, not the Daily Mirror, the Mirror. The Mirror is another UK publication similar to the Daily Mail, and they are also an easy target. So here's one. Drinking coffee could make you live longer and reduce the risk of cancer and heart disease. Here's the opposite. Are you a secret caffeine addict? The health dangers of drinking too much tea and coffee. Coffee can help you lose weight by burning fat, but also if you drink it after breakfast and not before, you might die. I love these headlines. Again, they are wonderful. I think the best part about the Mirror compared to the Mail is the descriptions under the under the headlines. So here's a person having a coffee, sitting on the bed and yawning. Anyway, let's go on. So the coffee benefits. I have to say, we do love running studies looking at the benefits of coffee more than we love running studies looking at the risks of coffee. There are so many that I cannot go over all of the epidemiological research on coffee in one slide or even in one presentation. We would be here until next year. So let's just run over a few of the studies looking at coffee that have found a benefit in terms of cancer. I found these all today. So there's a study showing a decreased risk of all these 7 cancers plus more. Though this is just the kind of the first few hundred that I managed to skim over. There are a lot. This is kind of an example of that. Coffee and tea intake, risk of head and neck cancer. So they found that there was a reduced risk of oropharyngeal cancers for an increment of 1 cup of coffee a day, which sounds great. I mean, this is a reduced risk of about 4%. Well, it's a reduced odds of 4% in terms of your risk of oropharyngeal cancer if you drink an extra cup of coffee per day. It's not a huge change in risk, but it still sounds very compelling. But let's go back to my slide where I was looking at harms. And if we think about this was a very large study. It combined several groups. It wasn't a systematic review, but it was a meta-analysis of sorts. It was fairly convincing. They found no benefit to coffee and all cancers. So reconciling that with all of these studies that appear to show a decreased risk of specific cancers is quite hard. What do we do with that? So the problem here is that all of this research into coffee and cancer, coffee and heart disease in populations is based on kind of broad nutritional epidemiological studies. And nutritional epidemiology is a very useful field. It allows us to identify potential risks and benefits in terms of nutrition and health at a very large scale. But it is really hard to untangle cause and effect only using this sort of evidence. Basically, this sort of study is extremely inconclusive, and it's also worth noting that, I've listed all of these things that we found a decreased risk of in one study. If you look at other studies on the same subject, so colorectal cancer is a great example. I found a study that showed a benefit from colorectal cancer that was reported as coffee reduces your risk by 24% in the news, reduces your risk of colorectal cancer. I then found a systematic review and meta-analysis that combined about a dozen studies into colorectal cancer and found no benefit. So even these benefits are often very inconclusive and very inconsistent, where depending on which research you rely on, you can either say that coffee has a very large benefit or no benefit at all. So cancer is very confounded. What about diabetes? I mean, this is the area that my main job is in, and I think it's also a very interesting point because drinking coffee definitely impacts your blood sugar, right? That's a fairly uncontroversial point, and there is very strong evidence, very consistent evidence, unlike some of these other topics, very consistent evidence that high intakes of coffee reduce your risk of diabetes, of getting diabetes. This is, again, a systematic review and meta-analysis. If you look at these studies, I mean, there is some inconsistency up at the top, but almost all of them found a reduced risk of diabetes in people who drink a lot of coffee compared to people who don't drink much coffee at all. And again, we come to a similar thing. So just like the harms, the benefits also are inconclusive. So again, a systematic review and meta-analysis of clinical trials into coffee and diabetes found that there may be short-term harms to drinking coffee in terms of your blood glucose metabolism, and the longer term, there may be modest benefits, but they're unconvincing. So again, what we've got is this epidemiological evidence that suggests a benefit towards coffee and diabetes that gets a lot of headlines. When we actually run a trial where we give one group coffee, we don't give the other group coffee, and we see if there's any benefit, we don't find a similar benefit in terms of coffee and diabetes. And it's just fascinating how often this story has repeated itself already. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is true of the harms and benefits and all epidemiological research, is thinking about the magnitude of these benefits and what you can expect. So this is a headline in an article. This was published in Fox News, where the study found that there was an 11% lower risk of type 2 diabetes if you increased your coffee intake by more than a cup a day. Now, I will firstly say that drinking more than a cup extra a day of coffee is a lot. So that's like, I drink 2 to 3 cups of coffee. That would be going to 3 to 4 to 5 cups of coffee a day for me, which is quite a bit, right? But 11% lower risk of type 2 diabetes does sound significant. It sounds very convincing. If I was at high risk of type 2 diabetes, that might be the sort of intervention that I would consider adopting. But that is the relative risk. The absolute risk is very different. So a very quick explanation. Relative risk is a ratio of risks, one to another. So this is what we talk about when you say, a doubling of risk. Going from 1 to 2% is doubling your risk. An absolute risk, or sometimes it's called the percentage point increase or decrease, in America particularly, they call it percentage points, is the difference in risks between those two numbers. So you can have a risk that doubles between 1 and 2%. That is an absolute increase of 1%. You can also have a risk that doubles from 0.00001% to 0.00002%. The absolute risk increase, however, is much, much, much smaller, even though the relative increase is the same. So here is the study that this headline was based on. That increasing your daily coffee consumption protects against type 2 diabetes. What you can see here is the groups either decreased or increased their coffee. So going from left to right, moderate to large, small to moderate decreases, no change, small to moderate, and moderate to large increases. So what we can look at here is the difference between our no change group and our moderate to large increase group. And what you see when you work out the absolute difference is that this 11% relative risk reduction equates to a 0.01% absolute risk reduction per year. Now, to put that in context, what it means is that if you took a group of 100,000 people who have no change to their coffee intake, you would expect to see roughly 400 new cases of diabetes per year. It's an incidence of diabetes of about 400 a year. If every single one of those 100,000 people who are currently drinking some amount of coffee, presumably relatively low, if every single person increased their intake of coffee by more than a cup a day and maintained that increase for over a year, you would expect that instead of 400 new cases of diabetes, there would be 390 new cases of diabetes in the 100,000 people. That is not a lot. That is a huge intervention, a massive, difficult to maintain thing to do for a huge group of people so that we can prevent 10 cases of diabetes. And so this is, I think, one of the more important points is that, yes, there are potential benefits to drinking coffee. There are potential harms to drinking coffee. The vast majority of them are of a magnitude that isn't very meaningful to the individual. They are this kind of really massive epidemiological finding that has meaning to to people like me who work at a population scale. They don't really mean all that much to me as an individual sitting here drinking my coffee. So what is the bottom line for coffee benefits? This slide may look familiar. I copied the same thing as the coffee harm slide. As I said, I'm not very funny. But so coffee is associated with benefits. We don't know if they're necessarily causal. Again, in lower doses, the benefits tend not to be as big, which is, I guess, a sign perhaps that it's not the coffee that's helping. But if you drink 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day, or 2 to 3, like yours truly, I'm not convinced that the evidence suggests that the evidence is strong enough to conclude that there's a significant benefit to health. Again, this isn't comprehensive. I like stressing this point because it's important. There may be benefits that I've missed. Who knows? But I think based on the research that I've seen, this is true pretty much across the board. So what is the take home for all of you people sitting at home watching me blather on? The harms are inconsistent and potentially not causal. The benefits are inconsistent and potentially not causal. But, and I think, again, this is a really important point. If you look at all the evidence, and you look at both the studies finding benefits and those finding harms, there is quite consistent evidence that even high intakes of coffee are probably safe. So this is especially true for your studies of kind of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, which are often what people worry about when they think about coffee. For diabetes, the association, even at 10 cups of coffee a day, still stays pretty strong. Often what you see with this sort of health association is that a U-shaped curve. So people who drink no coffee obviously have a risk of 1. The risk, sorry, this is a U-shaped curve, not an M-shaped curve. The U-shaped curve. So the risk decreases as the health benefit as you drink, 2 to 3 to 4 cups of coffee, and then suddenly it goes up and maybe goes above 1 at the very high intakes, because very high intakes are often unhealthy. In the case of coffee, I mean, I don't know if 10 cups of coffee a day is a very high intake. It depends on who you are and how you think. For me, that's a very high intake. But even this sort of quite large amounts of coffee on a daily basis do seem to be, in most research, quite safe. The final point, and I cannot stress this enough, if your doctor tells you to stop drinking coffee, stop drinking coffee. I am a man on the internet, and I only have the knowledge that I have garnered from reading a bunch of studies. I am not a doctor. I am not your treating clinician. I cannot give you advice that is personalized to your own health. My only piece of advice that is personalized to your own health is that if your naturopath tells you to stop drinking coffee, you should probably stop seeing a naturopath. And that is blanket advice. This is the end of my talk. I would now love for any questions about coffee. If you ask me questions about COVID-19, I will say no, because it is not a COVID talk. This is about something fun and interesting, and just enjoy yourselves.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I was just enjoying my coffee. Thank you very much, Gid. That was yeah, right. I bet that is coffee. In fact, the number one question, or one of the top questions that come in during your talk, and it's probably a very important question, gets to the nub of the matter, is what did you order for dinner?
Vietnamese food. There is a great place called Nem Viet in Zetland. If anyone wants what I consider to be the best Vietnamese takeout in Sydney, go there. I mean, order from there.
The views and opinions expressed by our guests are not. Sounds good to me, Gid. Did it come with coffee? Probably not.
It did not. They do a great Vietnamese iced coffee, but it's not really the time to drink that, I think. It's both too cold and too late. So,
a question from me to begin with. Why does coffee taste so good?
That is a question I cannot answer. I think, I'm sure that there's something to do with the wonderful addictive nature of caffeine, but yeah. I don't really know.
Which leads on to another question about coffee and addictive nature of caffeine. Coffee withdrawal, that's a real thing, yeah?
Again, this is actually something I should probably have researched before this talk, but I assume, caffeine, I assume there's some elements of withdrawal. Anything can have a psychological addiction, but I don't know too much about the physiological manifestations of caffeine withdrawal.
Could people report if they're regular coffee drinkers, if they have to go cold turkey, then they'll have a headache for a few days?
I have heard this. I haven't researched it.
Maybe our viewers might know something about that or have experienced that themselves. I think I have. When I was very ill a couple of years ago, I stopped drinking coffee because I was just too ill, and I developed a terrible headache. Maybe it was the illness. I'm not sure.
It does sound like it. There could be some confounding factor there.
But I felt better after a coffee, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions. And thank you to everybody who's been using Slido to enter your questions. Is it possible to damage kidneys by drinking lots of instant coffee in the same way as heavy drinking? Is it worse for heavy drinkers?
I think this is something, again, that potentially you would want to ask your doctor and not your epidemiologist. But I think the evidence from these sort of epidemiological trials is that persistent chronic coffee drinking doesn't harm your health or your kidneys, I think, generally speaking. So in terms of at least kidney disease, diabetes, kidney cancer, the evidence doesn't seem to support a strong link. But I would assume, again, probably better to ask your doctor, I would assume that a lot of coffee at one time could cause damage. So if you are going to engage in a coffee drinking competition, please do see your renal physician before you do so.
Good advice. Here's another question. How do researchers in the RCT make sure that the control group isn't having coffee when they're not looking?
Well, so most of them are quite smart. They give two people boxes of coffee that are blinded, and they are either decaf or they are caffeinated. So that's the one way to look at caffeine as an intervention, or caffeine as a part of coffee. The other way to do it is to give people something that resembles and tastes similar to coffee, but isn't coffee as a drink. So like hickory drinks, I think they use in the United States. There are a variety of methods that have been tried. Obviously, they don't taste the same as coffee, so there's some issues with blinding, but yeah. It's hard.
Yeah, interesting. Here's another question. I read about a recent study that suggested that people who drank coffee tended to be healthier than people who didn't drink coffee. Unhealthy don't like coffee.
So yeah, this is what we're talking about when we say confounding factors. So you've got, generally speaking, people who drink coffee, particularly like the range of coffee of like 2 to 3 to 4 cups a day, your average intake, tend to be a bit healthier than people who drink no coffee and people who drink tons of coffee. And this is an average across the population, so it certainly doesn't speak to the individual experience, but that's, you see more chronic diseases in people who drink absolutely no coffee than those who drink a few cups a day. And that's part of where these associations probably come from.
All right. Here's another question. Has there been any study on the mental health benefits of coffee? They say it makes you alert but relaxed. Many people hang out for their latte hit.
Well, I think there's possibly, again, this is a distinction between acute benefits, so drinking coffee and what it's going to do to you in the next day, and chronic drinking and what that's going to do to you over a lifetime. So I think there haven't been many studies that I could find on the association between caffeine intake and mental health disorders. They do tend to show some association, but it's hard to untease whether caffeine causes mental health issues or people with mental health issues drink more coffee. I do agree that caffeine and coffee both are vitally important to my acute mental health, in that if I don't drink my coffee first thing in the morning, I want to murder everyone. I think this is a very common experience. As my friend James says, coffee isn't important to my health, it's important to your health. But that is I'm not sure if there are any studies into the acute benefit of coffee and whether it makes you feel instantly better, but certainly anecdotally it does.
Well, yeah, I think people get into this habit of waking up in the morning, mumbling about getting to the kitchen, pouring their coffee, and maybe it's just part of the routine, or a coffee in the afternoon, I think. But I'm certainly one of those people, and as a skeptic, I must put aside my ideas, this correlation equals causation and all the rest of it. But if I have a couple of coffees or one coffee into the mid-afternoon, I invariably just have a terrible time getting to sleep in the evening. I really do. And I guess that's not an unfamiliar story.
Yeah, I think it's true of a lot of people.
Yeah. So I prefer to drink something else late into the afternoon.
Indeed.
Yeah. And just having a quick scan here now. Are the studies you speak of, are these studies usually controlled for socioeconomic status?
So one of the wonderful experiences of reading a lot of epidemiological research is that you'll find that each group uses different covariates in their model, so different controls. Some are, some aren't, is kind of the answer. There are also dozens of different ways to control for socioeconomic status. So some people control for a level of educational attainment. So, people so you divide people into groups based on whether they finished high school, whether they finished university, whether they've done a postgraduate, PhD, etc. And that gives you some idea, because people who've done more degrees tend to be a slightly higher income than people who haven't. But obviously it's not a good measure, because lots of people who don't go to university also earn lots of money, and it's challenging. Sometimes we control for socioeconomic status by controlling for income, but even that may not be a good measure of socioeconomic status, because you can have people who have a lot of assets but don't earn much money, so they don't have a great deal of income, but they are very wealthy. So yeah, basically some do, some don't. Some control for it well, some control for it poorly. It's a whole mix.
Another question that's come in: what's the allowance in these studies given for instant coffee, or what we might call percolated coffee or real coffee or something like that? Does that really come into it?
There are studies that have looked at instant versus espresso. I don't think there are many of them. They tend not to differentiate. They just ask people, how many cups of coffee do you drink a day?
Well, the follow-up question is, why does instant coffee taste so bad? But
yeah, look, I don't know. Maybe you're drinking the wrong brand. I'm not going to argue about the best brand of instant coffee. As someone who works in a hospital, all I drink, if I drink instant coffee, it's Nescafe Blend 43 or International Roast. So those are the ones I have experience with.
We'll time for one more question, I think, and then I'll go out and get a coffee. Are there studies relating speed of consumption to acute symptoms? Sudden high caffeine levels can cause palpitations. For example, 2 strong coffees in quick succession.
That I have to say, I haven't looked too much at the sort of biomedical research looking at the acute impacts of coffee. There's certainly some association between caffeine intake and acute changes to your body. I would assume that it can, particularly in people who are vulnerable to it, cause palpitations. But I haven't looked into it very much. I mean, I think there are certainly potential negatives to drinking a lot of coffee really quickly. That is perhaps unsurprising. Even if it's not a neurotoxic dose, it could cause you some discomfort. But I haven't looked into that quite so much.
All right, that's fine. Well, look, on that note, we'll leave the talk there. Thank you, Gid. That was really interesting. What I love about Skeptics in the Pub is we have such a wide range of speakers and topics. I mean, the health benefits, yes or no, of coffee is a very interesting topic, and it doesn't mention ghosts or UFOs or psychics or COVID-19. So we're all very relieved. Thank you about that.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The talk that I put together this morning
over a coffee.
I'm sorry I couldn't answer every question, but unfortunately, I've yet to experience the infinite knowledge that I wish for.
Well, but you have to have dinner. I mean, I understand these things. I'm sure
Indeed.
that viewers do. Anyway, but once again, Gid, thank you very much, and on behalf of all the viewers out there, thank you indeed.
My pleasure.
So everybody, thank you for tuning in for Skeptics in the Pub online. We had planned and hoped to be back in the pub. We were the month before, the previous Skeptics in the Pub, and we thought, this is great, we're all back in the pub again. And then, well, unfortunately, well, you know what happened. We hope to have Skeptics in the Pub next month with our special guest speaker, Professor Paul Willis. Please keep an eye on the meetup page to find out whether we really will be back in the pub. And if we are, then please, by all means, come and join us. If you're in Sydney, everybody's welcome. It's at the Occidental Hotel. As we skeptics say, fingers crossed. But until our next meeting, be it online or in person at the pub, this is Richard Saunders wishing you a good evening from Sydney, Australia.